In Module 6, we're talking about ecology and culture once more, as well as going into more on ethnicity and talking about class. In the film, we saw the many travails of the ocean and the overfishing that has occurred in the world up to this point. And of course, we also want to think about the solutions that make sense. I think this concept of the ocean as a commons, something that we all share or we all can take part in, is very important. But then what happens to something that is a commons? Is it a tragedy in that everybody just overexploits it because we all have access to it? Or can we learn to share and work together? And this, of course, is a basic question about not only the ocean, but everything we have on the planet. In relationship to solutions, you heard about having particular zones that fishing can be done in, certain time periods, certain sales that can happen and not happen, kinds of fish, ages of fish, the types of fishing that it can occur, lots of limitations that are being put on by international agencies. This is all great. Enforcing it is sometimes more difficult. I had a student several years ago who worked as an inspector on board fishing vessels up in Alaskan waters, and she was responsible for estimating the amount of fish and the kinds of fish that they were catching. So she was part of the enforcing, or the attempt to enforce, these solutions. So quotas are a very important part of this, and that comes out both in the film and in the lecture by Dr. Gerke. Quotas can really vary a lot by context. We have subsistence quotas and we have commercial quotas. So a subsistence quota is the quota for people who actually subsist on, that is, that they eat and they get their income from the fish, the salmon in Kamchatka, for example, that Dr. Gerke talked about. Commercial quotas are quite different because this is people who are certainly making a living, but it's in the guise of larger groups, not people who subsist mainly on these fish, and it's also often companies. Companies, of course, have their goal as profit, and we don't put limits on how much profits companies can make. They have the right and the goal to morally make a profit. So commercial quotas are very important in order to limit this kind of limitless profit that companies can go for. Poaching also comes into this difference by contexts. So what is considered poaching from an international point of view in relation to salmon might be very different when you're on the ground in Kamchatka and you're hungry and you see your neighbor, catching fish at a place or at a time which isn't technically legal, but they need it or you need it in order to survive. Then that's quite different, and they judge it differently. So there's a local context, an everyday kind of context in which the poaching isn't really considered to be poaching. This is a really good example of it. This is a cultural explanation for cultural resources, and this is one area which cultural anthropologists are very strong and able to contribute to the understanding at the international and national level of what's going on at the local everyday level. What do local people who subsist on fish or shellfish, seaweed, various products from the ocean, what do they need in their local lives? Anthropologists are good brokers or bridges between the different levels in this way. So these people are really claiming their cultural entitlement within formal and informal institutions. So Dr. Gerke talks about formal institutions such as these international agencies, but there's also informal institutions. In this case, with the salmon fishers in Kamchatka, there are many informal rules and certain organization that they have in relationship to each other. They're not written down, but they're very important in both maintaining a certain morality of what they do there and in enabling their own survival. We have informal institutions, for example, taking food to a neighbor at a time of a funeral, or making study groups. That's an informal thing that you organize, but is a kind of institution. Our anthropologist for this week is named Ray Rappaport. He was a teacher of mine at University of Michigan. He went to New Guinea and studied these ritual feasts in which these tribes ate pigs with their neighbors, their friendly neighbors. They had big parties and dances and feasts. Everybody was able to eat the pigs that ordinarily they raised, but they weren't able to eat. And it was also the start for warfare with some of their enemies. In order to get more land, people were also killed in these wars. So his idea was that this was an informal institution, but it was controlling the population of the pigs, it was feeding people, and it was also controlling the human population. So we're dealing with a situation of great global endangerment here, with the oceans being overfished. Endangered is the fish stock, obviously. Endangered is fishermen. In fact, we only need to go about an hour here from Corvallis to Newport on the coast to find people who have lost their jobs because of overfishing in the ocean and also because of policies that are protecting the oceans. Also endangered are people who eat mostly fish. About 2 billion people in the world mostly subsist on fish or the things from the ocean. 90% of what we eat, as far as fish go, is imported. So we're putting a lot of strain on those people. One of the ideas of what is endangered is that many small fish and shellfish are also caught kind of as a byproduct of fishing for big fish like tuna and salmon that we like so much. And in doing that, about 40 million metric tons per year of small fish are lost instead of being eaten. In the U.S., we eat about 10 fish more than anything else, and I'll just name here the top 5: shrimp, canned tuna, salmon, tilapia, and pollock. So we don't have a very wide, diverse palate or taste for fish in the U.S. And of course, that's important because the U.S. is a big market. And so we determine a lot of what is caught in the oceans, not entirely by any means. Chinese, for example, have a much wider array of fish and other seaweed and so on that they eat from the ocean. But at any rate, we tend to fish from just this small group, and therefore there's a lot of fish that don't get eaten. This summer I heard a chef named Barton Seaver who runs a restaurant in New York City, and he urges people, his customers included, to eat more different kinds of fish. On his menu you'll find everything of all kinds, and he even told the story of how one time he got a bunch of flying fish, which was all his fishermen down in the Caribbean could catch, and these are very small and usually not eaten. They're usually used for bait, but he made a whole dinner from these flying fish. So it was one good example of how we can eat much more widely from the ocean. So he urged that we really should eat fish. They're both nutritional and they also help with greenhouse gas. We'll come back to that in just a second. He urged people to eat lower on the food chain, so try to eat anchovies and sardines. Often they're in canned form, or clams that actually clean the bottom of the ocean. These smaller fish are very nutritious, not very expensive, and they allow us to use the what is in the ocean much more efficiently. Don't be afraid of eating canned food and canned fish and frozen fish. They're very healthy, and all fish you eat really has been frozen at some point or another just to get to the stores. In 2011, in the U.S., people ate 15 pounds of fish per person, as opposed to 153 pounds of beef eaten per person per year in the U.S. Now again, this is U.S. centered. And we're not big fish eaters. If you went to Japan and China, Vietnam, etc., you would have a very different situation. But about 18% of the global carbon emissions come from raising livestock. And this is particularly cows, right? Cows eat about 5 times the amount of grain that people do in the U.S. So there's a great amount of land that is used to feed beef. Also, it uses a lot of water, particularly in the intensified ways that beef cows are now raised. Also, it uses fossil fuels. and even just the burps and manure of cows, which sounds kind of funny, but they create a lot of greenhouse gases themselves. So we can do a favor for the planet if we eat less beef and eat more fish. Now, we have to also, though, follow some of these other ideas. Be open, for example, as I've said, to eating lower on the food chain, but also eating aquacultured farmed fish. Sievers mentions that it's becoming much safer. The standards are becoming better, and you don't really have to worry about disease. These farmed fish are well labeled, and if they come from U.S., Canada, Scotland, Chile, Norway, they're good for you. Ask for more kinds of whitefish at your stores. Shop at places with diverse types of fish. Also this week we're talking about class and ethnicity in seeking food rights. Class is very important and can be judged in different ways. For one thing, it can be judged from a production point of view. So it's always about economic differences among people. In one way it might be, well, I own the factory, so I'm obviously of a higher class than a person who is working in the factory, as an example. Consumption can also show differences in class, and that's become increasingly important as we consume more and more in the world. So well, shrimp is a good example. I know shrimp and I can afford shrimp and I eat shrimp, whereas maybe someone who is much poorer can only afford potatoes, and maybe they really like potatoes, but their very taste for potatoes as opposed to my taste for shrimp marks us out as being in different classes. So we judge class in all sorts of ways. We recognize it quickly, but we don't often bring it to the top of our minds as to what exactly it is. We judge it by houses, by dress, by people's teeth, all sorts of things, the way people talk, and so on. So this is something that you can be more aware of. This comes up in Uzbekistan, people going up to Russia, making a lot of money, and coming back and being quite wealthy in Uzbekistan. Those who are high income can have meat and plov whenever they want. They can get goods from outside of Uzbekistan. Their children can study abroad. More low-income people only eat meat rarely, particularly on special occasions if they can, but it's a real treat for them. Here you see a picture of much poorer women selling vegetables on the street. They go to a wholesale market and buy it and then sell it on the street for a few pennies more. It's actually illegal, and the police will come and get them out of there, but in the meantime they can make a little bit. But people, because they don't have meat, because their children can't get good education, feel deprived and angry, and that comes out in a feeling of very covert resistance. Ethnicity is another important area that we talk about. We have primordial ethnicity and situational ethnicity. Primordial ethnicity is that idea that an ethnic group is always the same, they have the same essence through history. So we've always been Uzbek. Well, we can see from the way we read about this in the book that that's very untrue. People haven't always been Uzbek. It's a whole conglomeration of lots of different people, and it changes over time. Koreans might say, we've always been Korean. But as I indicate here, Koreans are now divided into North Korea, which have a slightly different accent even now than people in South Korea, certainly a different political system. There are Uzbek Koreans, there are American Koreans. So Korean is very situational, right? And situational ethnicity is that idea that ethnic groups and cultures change over time and place. So it's a very flexible, malleable thing, this thing we call ethnicity, with borders and contents changing all the time. So with situational ethnicity, this picture shows us Tajik people, students in high school in Bukhara in Uzbekistan. They do not study in Tajik, they study in Uzbek. They're not allowed to study in Tajik, and they are often urged to actually call themselves Uzbek. So we see that as a real kind of situational ethnicity. Also, the Koreans who were banished from far east Russia to come to the Uzbek countryside, gradually their situation has changed too, and they're re-emerging into food businesses, restaurants, and high tech. Also, some of them are marrying people in Korea who they see are richer and trying to better their lives. Finally, I just urge you to think about all of this. Have you seen ethnic groups changing in your life? Have you seen it staying the same? How do you notice class differences? with your friends, with people who aren't your friends, with people as you walk around campus? What marks people as being higher or lower class than you? So I urge you to not only think about this and notice it in your own life, but have conversations about it as well.